The cold metallic click of a gun being drawn is a sound that slices through the quiet evening air, a sound that promises violence and finality. For Dr. Alana Hayes, it was a sound she was professionally familiar with, but had never had directed at her in blind, ignorant rage. The officer's face, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights, was a mask of smug authority. "Federal agent, that's a good one," he sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. He couldn't know that his laughter, echoing in the humid Georgia air, was the sound of his own world ending. He thought he held all the power. In 2 minutes, he would learn in the harshest way possible just how wrong he was. The drive into Oak Haven, Georgia, was a journey back in time for Dr. Alana Hayes. The setting sun cast long, lazy shadows across the 2-lane highway, painting the towering pines in hues of gold and orange. It was a beautiful, tranquil scene, a world away from the cold, sterile briefing rooms of the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit in Quantico. She had traded crime scene photos for the sweet scent of honeysuckle and the chirping of crickets. Her mother, Sarah Hayes, was the reason for the trip. A retired literature professor, Sarah's mind was still as sharp as a tack, but her body was failing her. A recent diagnosis had accelerated Alana's planned visit, turning it from a casual holiday into a precious, urgent mission to soak up every moment she could. She was just Alana here, not Special Agent Hayes, the woman who hunted monsters. She was just a daughter coming home. Her rental, a standard black sedan, hummed along the near-empty road. She was mentally scrolling through her mother's favorite grocery list pecans for baking sweet tea, stone-ground grits, when the world behind her exploded in a strobing kaleidoscope of red and blue. Alana's heart didn't jump. It settled. Her training kicked in instantly, a calm, cool river, flowing over the initial spark of annoyance. She checked her speed exactly 55 up the posted limit. She signaled her hands moving with practiced economy and pulled the car onto the gravel shoulder, the tires crunching softly. She cut the engine turned on the interior dome light and placed both hands on the top of the steering wheel, fingers spread. Standard procedure. Make them feel safe. She watched in her rearview mirror as a stocky figure emerged from the Oak Haven County Sheriff's patrol car. He was built like a fire plug with a thick neck and a swagger in his walk that spoke of a man who enjoyed the authority his uniform gave him. He approached the passenger side, a classic intimidation tactic, forcing her to turn and crane her neck to address him. Alana remained perfectly still. The officer whose name tag read D. Miller tapped on the window with a thick knuckle. She smoothly lowered the window. The humid Georgia night air, thick with the smell of damp earth and pine, washed over her. "Evening, Ma'am," he said, his voice, a low drawl that held no warmth. His eyes, small and dark, roamed over her, then the car's interior, lingering on her leather briefcase on the passenger seat. "Good evening, Officer Alana," replied her voice even and calm. "Was I speeding, license and registration?" He grunted, ignoring her question. His gaze was dismissive, his posture aggressive. Alana could read him like a book she'd studied 1,000 times. The stance, the clipped tone, the refusal to answer a direct question, it was all about establishing dominance from the outset. She maintained eye contact. "Officer, my wallet is in my purse, on the passenger side floor, and the rental agreement is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now, very slowly." He just grunted an affirmation, his hand resting casually on the butt of his service weapon. Alana moved with deliberate slow motions, retrieving the documents. As she passed them over his eyes, narrowed on her hands, then her face. "You're a long way from home," he said, looking at her Virginia driver's license. The subtext was clear. "You don't belong here." "Visiting family?" she said, simply offering no more information than was necessary. He took his time shining his flashlight on the documents, as if searching for a hidden flaw. Finally, he handed them back. "The reason I pulled you over is your right side tail light is out." Alana's eyebrows knitted together slightly. "Officer, I did a full vehicle check before I left the rental agency in Atlanta not 3 hours ago." The lights were all functioning. A flicker of irritation crossed Miller's face. He wasn't used to being questioned. "Well, it's out now. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle." The request was a clear escalation. It wasn't standard procedure for a simple traffic violation. Alana's internal alarm, the one honed by years of studying predators, began to ring. "With all due respect, officer, why do I need to exit my vehicle for a supposed broken tail light?" she asked, her tone still respectful, but now firm. "You have my license. The registration is in order. You can write the ticket, and I'll be on my way." Miller's face hardened. The veneer of professional courtesy, thin as it was, vanished completely. "Because I told you to. Now step out of the car or I'll pull you out." This was the crossroads. This was the moment where a routine, albeit prejudiced stop, turned into something else. Alana knew her rights. She also knew that in a dark country road with an officer, this agitated rights were often a theoretical concept. But she was not just any citizen. She was a federal officer who had sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution, and she would not have her own rights trampled by a bully with a badge. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice now carrying a new weight of authority. "I do not consent to stepping out of my vehicle, as you have not provided any probable cause to suggest a crime has been committed beyond the traffic infraction you've alleged. I will remain here while you write your citation." The defiance, spoken so calmly, seemed to enrage him. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. "I'm giving you one last chance," he hissed, his hand unsnapping the holster of his gun. Alana took a slow, deep breath. "Officer, I would advise you to rethink your course of action. Tired of you big city types thinking you can tell us how to do our jobs." He spat. Out of the car, now he yanked on the door handle. It was locked. His rage boiled over. In one swift, shocking motion, he drew his Glock 19. The metallic click of the weapon being freed from its holster echoed in the small space. He aimed it directly at her face. "Out of the damn car," he roared, spittle flying from his lips. The world seemed to slow down. The crickets, the humid air, the flashing lights, it all faded into the background. All that existed was the black, unblinking eye of the gun's muzzle and the hateful, ignorant eyes of the man holding it. Staring down the barrel of a gun does strange things to time. For Alana, seconds stretched into eternities. Her training didn't just kick in, it became her. Fear was a distant hum, a passenger in a car she was now driving with ice-cold precision. She saw the tremor in Officer Miller's hand, the slight widening of his pupils. He was high on adrenaline and power, a dangerous cocktail. He was also, she noted, making a career-ending, life-altering mistake. She didn't raise her hands in surrender. She didn't plead. She held his gaze, her own expression, a mask of calm composure that seemed to infuriate him even more. "Officer Miller," she said, her voice dropping, taking on the clipped authoritative tone she used in interrogation rooms. "You are currently committing a felony. You are holding a federal officer at gunpoint. I strongly suggest you lower your weapon." A harsh, barking laugh erupted from Miller's throat. It was a sound of pure derision, of disbelief mixed with contempt. "A federal officer? Oh, that's rich," he sneered, shaking his head. "You think that's your get-out-of-jail-free card? Flashing some fake ID, I've seen it all." Alana maintained her unflinching stare. My credentials are in my briefcase on the passenger seat. My badge is on my belt under my jacket. If you lower your weapon, I will present them to you. I'm not lowering a damn thing, he snarled. You pull out a fake badge and I'll pull this trigger. You understand me? This was the most dangerous moment. Any sudden move could be misinterpreted. He was too agitated, too committed to his own narrative of a defiant woman who needed to be put in her place. Okay, Alana said, her voice soothing, disarming. I hear you. I'm not going to do anything to spook you. My jacket is unbuttoned. I'm going to use my left hand, my non-dominant hand, to slowly move the jacket aside so you can see my service weapon and my credentials. Is that acceptable to you, Officer Miller? She was speaking his language now. Officer safety. Non-dominant hand. She was de-escalating, giving him an off-ramp, a way to save face. He hesitated, the sneer on his face, faltering for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. He nodded curtly. With a slowness that was almost painful, Alana moved her left hand to the lapel of her blazer. She peeled it back, revealing two things. First, the butt of a Sig Sauer P229, her FBI-issued sidearm holstered securely. Second, clipped to her belt right beside it, was the unmistakable gold shield of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It glinted in the flashing patrol lights, the eagle's wings seeming to catch fire in the strobing red. Miller's eyes locked onto the badge. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the hum of his patrol car's engine. Alana expected recognition. She expected a dawning horror, a sudden panicked realization of the colossal error he had just made. Instead, he laughed again. But this time it was different. It was louder, more forced, laced with a new layer of angry disbelief. You've got to be kidding me, he said, shaking his head. An FBI badge. You think I'm that stupid? Where'd you buy that on the internet? Nice try, sweetheart. Real cute. The word sweetheart dripped with a venomous condescension that solidified Alana's resolve. He didn't just disbelieve her. He was fundamentally incapable of seeing her as a figure of authority. In his small, prejudiced world, a black woman driving a nice car couldn't possibly be a federal agent. She had to be a liar, a fraud, someone playing a part. His ego wouldn't allow for any other possibility. This, Alana realized, was no longer about de-escalation. This was about survival and justice. Officer Miller, she said, her voice, now hard as steel, devoid of any attempt to soothe him. Look at the badge. Badge number 734. My name is Special Agent Alana Hayes, Behavioral Analysis Unit Quantico. The weapon I am carrying is a federally issued Sig Sauer P229. You have approximately 30 seconds to lower your weapon and call your supervisor to this scene before I am forced to treat this as a carjacking and a direct threat to the life of a federal officer in the line of duty. Her recitation was rote precise and utterly confident. It was the kind of declaration that should have frozen the blood in any cop's veins. But Miller was too far gone. Her confidence, her refusal to be intimidated, was a direct challenge to his authority. He saw it as arrogance, not professionalism. In the line of duty you're visiting family, he mocked, spitting the word out. You're done. Hands on the wheel. Both of them. Now. He gestured menacingly with his gun. The moment for talk was over. He was doubling down on his catastrophic mistake. Alana slowly placed her left hand back on the steering wheel. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Her weapon was holstered. He had the drop on her. But she had one more tool at her disposal. One he couldn't see. With her right hand still on the wheel, she subtly angled her thumb downwards. Her fingers remained visible, but her thumb found the voice command button on the steering wheel. She pressed it. A soft chime, barely audible over the engine noise, signaled that her car's Bluetooth system was active and connected to her phone. "Call SAC Richardson," she said, her voice low but clear. Miller frowned. "What did you say?" "Nothing, officer," she replied calmly, her eyes locked on his. Through the car's speakers, a faint ringing sound could be heard. Miller's eyes darted around the cabin, confused. Then a Matten's gruff, no-nonsense voice filled the car, clear as day. "Hayes, it's 8 p.m. This better be good." It was Frank Richardson, the special agent in charge of her unit, a man who had seen it all and who did not suffer fools. Miller's jaw went slack. The sound of another voice, an authoritative male voice, threw him completely off balance. Alana never broke eye contact with him. Her voice was a blade. "Frank," she said, "I have a situation. I am on Highway 17, approximately 5 miles north of Oak Haven, Georgia. I am being held at gunpoint by a local officer, Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department. His name is Officer D. Miller. Badge number appears to be 112. He has refused to acknowledge my federal credentials and has threatened to shoot me." Silence. On the other end of the line and inside the car, the crickets seemed to have stopped chirping. The only sound was the thrum of the 2 engines and the sudden ragged sound of Officer Miller's breathing. The smugness was gone. The rage was gone. His face, illuminated in the strobing lights, had gone from flushed red to a pasty, sickly white. The hand holding the Glock was no longer steady. It was shaking violently. The laughter had died in his throat. In its place was the silent scream of a man who had just realized he hadn't just stepped over a line. He had leaped off a cliff. Frank Richardson was a man of few words, but his silence was more terrifying than another man's shouting. On the other end of the line, the seconds of quiet stretched out thick with menace. Alana knew what was happening. Richardson was a master of multitasking under pressure. In that silence, he was already typing on his computer, alerting the Atlanta field office, pulling up a map, and likely notifying the Department of Justice. He was a force of nature, and she had just aimed him like a weapon at Officer Dale Miller. "Stay on the line." Hayes Richardson's voice finally boomed through the car speakers, stripped of all pleasantries. It was the voice of a commander in battle. "Is the officer's weapon still aimed at you?" "Affirmative, SAC." Alana said, her eyes still locked on Miller. The officer looked like a statue carved from fear. His gun was still pointing at her, but it seemed to be an involuntary act, his muscles locked in place by sheer panic. His knuckles were white. Officer Miller Richardson's voice was a crack of thunder inside the small sedan. "This is Special Agent in Charge, Frank Richardson, of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You have 10 seconds to holster your weapon and place your hands on the roof of your patrol car. Failure to comply will be treated as an act of aggression against the United States government." The threat was not an exaggeration. Assaulting a federal officer is one of the most serious crimes an individual can commit, and for another law enforcement officer to do it was unthinkable. Miller's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was completely out of his depth, a schoolyard bully who had just picked a fight with a heavyweight champion. His world had shrunk to the confines of this dusty roadside, the damning voice on the speaker, and the calm, unwavering eyes of the woman he had just threatened. 10, 9, 8. Richardson began to count his voice, cold and methodical. At the count of 7, something in Miller finally broke. A choked sob escaped his lips. With a clatter, he holstered his weapon, his movements clumsy and panicked. He stumbled backward away from her car, his hands flying up in a gesture of universal surrender. Okay, it's away. It's holstered," he stammered, his voice a high-pitched whine. "Confirm, Hayes," Richardson commanded. "Weapon is holstered, SAC. The officer is moving away from my vehicle. Alana reported her own breathing remaining slow and steady. She was still in control. Good. The sheriff of Oakhaven County, Marcus Brody, is en route to your location. Atlanta field office has a tactical team scrambling. Do not engage further. Keep the line open. Alana watched as Miller practically fell back against his patrol car, his face slick with sweat. He looked at her, his expression a pathetic mix of terror and pleading. The bully had vanished, replaced by a frightened man who could see the chasm opening up beneath him. He had laughed at her badge. 2 minutes later, the full, terrifying weight of what that badge represented was crashing down on him. Less than a minute later, another set of headlights appeared coming fast from the direction of town. A larger vehicle, a Chevy Tahoe, pulled up, its own lights flashing. The seal of the Oakhaven County Sheriff was on the door. A tall, graying man in his late 50s, Sheriff Marcus Brody, stepped out. He was the opposite of Miller Lean, weathered with an air of quiet competence. His eyes took in the scene in an instant, his deputy pale and shaking, the black sedan with Virginia plates, the woman inside poised and calm. Brody approached Alana's car, his movements cautious, but not aggressive. He stopped a respectful 10 feet away. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "I'm Sheriff Brody. Can you tell me what's going on here?" Before Alana could speak, Richardson's voice cut through the air again from her car's speakers. "Sheriff Brody, this is SAC, Frank Richardson, FBI. Your Deputy Officer Miller has just held one of my agents at gunpoint. The situation is now a federal matter." Brody's face went rigid. He closed his eyes for a second, a deep sigh escaping his lips. It was the sigh of a man who had seen this coming, who knew one of his own was a liability, and had prayed this day would never arrive. He looked over at Miller with an expression of profound disappointment and anger. "Understood," Sir Brody said, his voice tight, addressing the disembodied voice from the car. He turned his full attention to Miller. "Dale, get over here. Now." Miller shuffled forward like a man walking to the gallows. "Give me your weapon," Brody commanded, holding out his hand. Numbly, Miller unholstered his Glock and handed it over, grip first. Brody took it, engaged the safety, and tucked it into his own belt. "Now your cuffs." Miller's eyes widened in horror. "Sheriff, Marcus, your cuffs." Dale Brody repeated, his voice like ice. "Now." With trembling hands, Miller unclipped his own handcuffs from his belt and handed them to the sheriff. The karmic justice of the moment was breathtaking. Alana watched a silent observer to the implosion of a man's career. The very tools of his authority were being stripped from him, one, by his own boss. Sheriff Brody grabbed Miller's arm, spun him around with surprising force, and pushed him against the hood of his own patrol car. "Dale Miller, you are under arrest for aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer," Brody said, his voice ringing with grim finality as he clicked the cold steel of Miller's own cuffs around his wrists. The man who had been laughing with a gun in his hand just minutes before was now in cuffs, his face pressed against the car he used to project his power. From the speaker of her sedan, Alana could hear SAC Richardson's voice, calm and satisfied. Hayes' report. She took her first truly deep breath of the evening. "Suspect is in custody, SAC. Local sheriff has secured the scene. The federal hammer hadn't just fallen. It had shattered Dale Miller's world into 1,000,000 pieces. The arrival of the FBI was not subtle. Within an hour, the quiet stretch of Highway 17 looked like a scene from a Hollywood blockbuster. Black Suburbans with government plates descended, disgorging a dozen agents in tactical vests, their faces grim and all business. They moved with an efficiency that made the local department look like amateurs. The scene was cordoned off, measurements were taken, and every inch of both vehicles was photographed. Alana finally stepped out of her car, her legs slightly stiff. The Atlanta field office SAC, a man named David Brown greeted her with a firm handshake and a look of deep concern. "Agent Hayes," he said, "glad you're okay. SAC Richardson sends his regards and his apologies that you had to deal with this on your personal time." "It's no longer personal time, is it?" Alana replied, her voice steady. "No," Brown agreed. "It isn't." Dale Miller, looking utterly defeated, had been transferred to the back of Sheriff Brody's Tahoe. He refused to speak, his eyes fixed on the floor. Sheriff Brody, meanwhile, was a man caught between loyalty to his department and the undeniable catastrophic failure of one of his own. He approached Alana and Agent Brown, his hat in his hands. "Agent Hayes, there aren't words. On behalf of my department, I am profoundly sorry. There is no excuse for what happened here tonight." Sheriff, was this the first time Officer Miller has had a complaint filed against him? For excessive force or racial profiling, Alana asked her question, direct and clinical. Brody's weary face seemed to age another 10 years. He hesitated, the politics of his position warring with the truth. "He's had a few complaints, from out-of-towners mostly. Nothing ever stuck. Dale's got family in this county going back generations. People tend to look the other way." "We won't be looking the other way," Agent Brown stated flatly. The investigation began that night with Alana giving her official statement at the now crowded Oak Haven Sheriff's Department. The place was a hive of frantic activity. Deputies who would have barely glanced at her a few hours before were now jumping to get her coffee, their faces a mixture of fear and awe. The power dynamic had been inverted so completely it was almost dizzying. As she recounted the events, every detail precise and unemotional, she realized the case was bigger than her own assault. Miller's laughter, his utter refusal to believe she could be an FBI agent, wasn't just about her. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness. A man that, comfortable with his own prejudice and power, doesn't use it just once. The next morning, the U.S. Attorney's Office officially took over the case. Dale Miller was charged with assault on a federal officer and deprivation of rights under color of law. But the FBI investigation, now co-led by Alana at the insistence of SAC Richardson, was just getting started. They didn't just want Miller, they wanted the rot he represented. They began by seizing Miller's patrol car, specifically his dash cam and body cam footage. His partner, a young, nervous deputy named Kevin Evans, was brought in for questioning. Evans, terrified of both the FBI and the potential reprisal from his colleagues, was a tough nut to crack. Alana sat in on the interview. She didn't say a word for the first hour, simply observing as two agents from Atlanta hammered Evans with questions. He gave canned evasive answers, insisting Miller was a good cop who just had a bad night. Finally, Alana leaned forward. "Deputy Evans," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm the agent officer." Miller pulled his weapon on. "I'm not an internal affairs investigator. I'm a profiler. I study behavior. And right now, your behavior tells me you're not scared of us. You're scared of what we'll find when we look at Miller's record. And you're scared because you stood by and watched it happen." Evans's composure cracked. His eyes darted nervously towards the one-way mirror. Alana pressed on. "I've seen this before, Deputy. A senior officer who bullies, who cuts corners. A rookie who is too intimidated to speak up. But a federal grand jury won't care if you were intimidated. They will only care if you were complicit. Right now you have a choice. You can be a witness or you can be a co-conspirator." That was the key. Over the next 2 hours, the story spilled out. Evans described a pattern of behavior from Miller that was horrifying. Miller would target out-of-state plates, particularly if the drivers were minorities. He'd conduct illegal searches, often pocketing small amounts of cash or valuables. He'd brag about teaching people a lesson. The broken taillight was his favorite pretext. He even kept a small hammer in his patrol bag to help a taillight become broken if a driver questioned him. The most damning revelation came when Evans mentioned the case of Javier Reyes. "Who is Javier Reyes?" Alana asked. Evans swallowed hard. "A kid. Drove through a few months back, heading to a construction job in Florida. Miller pulled him over, claimed he smelled marijuana. Searched his truck, found nothing. He was furious. I saw him go back to his patrol car, and then when he searched the kid's truck again, he found a bag of cocaine under the seat. Javier Reyes, a 20-year-old with no prior record, had taken a plea deal terrified of a long prison sentence. He was currently serving 3 years in a state penitentiary. Alana felt a cold fury settle in her chest. This was the true cost of Miller's abuse. It wasn't just about her own terrifying encounter. It was about the lives he had ruined with his unchecked power. The FBI team located Javier Reyes in prison. They found the original case file, and on Miller's body cam footage from that night, which he had conveniently forgotten to turn off when he went back to his car, the audio was crystal clear. Miller could be heard muttering to himself, "Let's see how this city boy likes a real charge," followed by the distinct sound of a glove box opening and closing in his own patrol car before he went back to plant the evidence. The case against Dale Miller had just exploded. It was no longer about a single assault. It was about a deep-seated corruption that had poisoned the town's justice system. The unraveling of Oakhaven had begun, and Alana Hayes was standing right at the center of the storm. The news of the expanded investigation hit Oakhaven like a thunderclap. The initial story of a local cop arrested for threatening an FBI agent was shocking enough, but the revelations about planted evidence and a pattern of predatory traffic stops sent tremors through the community. The good old boy network that had protected Dale Miller for years began to fracture under the immense pressure of a federal probe. Miller, sitting in a federal detention center, was no longer the swaggering bully from the roadside. His lawyer, a high-priced attorney from Atlanta named Wallace Thorne, advised him to keep his mouth shut. Thorne's strategy was clear pain to Lana as an arrogant, aggressive federal agent who overreacted, and portray Miller as a simple country cop who felt threatened and made a mistake. It was a narrative that might have worked in another time and place. But they didn't count on two things: the irrefutable evidence on the body cam and the quiet resolve of Alana Hayes. Alana took a few days to be with her mother. Sarah Hayes, frail but fierce, held her daughter's hand. "They picked the wrong woman to mess with, didn't they?" she said, a proud glint in her tired eyes. That time with her mother refueled Alana, reminding her of the stakes of the world of good and decent people that men like Miller sought to terrorize. Returning to the makeshift command center the FBI had set up in a local hotel, Alana focused on building an airtight case. The key was to show that Miller was not an anomaly, but a predator who exploited his position. They re-interviewed every person who had filed a complaint against him in the last 5 years. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. A black family from Chicago pulled over for a swerving violation they insisted never happened, had their car illegally tossed for over an hour on the side of the road, their children crying in the back seat. A young Hispanic couple on their honeymoon had $500 in cash. Their wedding gift money disappeared from the glove compartment during a search, a loss they couldn't prove. One by one, the victims were flown in to testify before a grand jury. Their accounts, combined with Deputy Evans's insider testimony and the damning footage, painted a portrait of a man drunk on power. The blue wall of silence, the unwritten rule that cops don't rat on other cops, began to crumble around Oakhaven. 2 other deputies, seeing the writing on the wall and offered immunity deals, came forward to corroborate Evans's stories. They described Miller as a cancer in the department, someone everyone was afraid of, but no one had the courage to confront. Sheriff Brody was forced to make a public statement. His face etched with shame, he announced a full audit of the department and placed 3 other officers known associates of Miller on administrative leave. He was cleaning house, but it was too little, too late. The trust between the community and its police force was shattered. The most powerful moment came when Javier Reyes was brought from prison to the federal courthouse. Dressed in an ill-fitting suit provided by the FBI, the young man walked with a slight shuffle. His eyes downcast, the light seemingly extinguished from them. Alana met with him before his testimony. "Javier," she said gently, "I know this is difficult, but what you do today will ensure that this never happens to anyone else." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep, weary sadness. "He ruined my life. I lost my job, my fiancé left me. All for nothing. He just decided to ruin my life." "And now you get to take a piece of his," Alana replied, her voice firm. "You get to tell the truth. That is a power he can never take from you." Before the grand jury, Javier Reyes's testimony was quiet, understated, and utterly devastating. He recounted the traffic stop, the confusion, the terror, and the despair of being forced to plead guilty to a crime he didn't commit. When the U.S. attorney played the audio from Miller's body cam, a collective gasp went through the room. The sound of Miller muttering to himself as he retrieved the planted drugs was the nail in his coffin. The grand jury took less than an hour. They returned a true bill, indicting Dale Miller on an additional 10 counts, including evidence tampering, perjury, and multiple civil rights violations. They also indicted one of the other suspended officers as an accessory in 2 other cases. The federal hammer hadn't just fallen on one man. It was taking a wrecking ball to a corrupt institution. Wallace Thorne, Miller's attorney, tried to spin the narrative to the press, calling it a federal overreach and a witch hunt. But the evidence was too strong, the victims too credible. Dale Miller, the man who laughed at an FBI badge, was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in a federal prison, his name becoming a byword for corruption and the abuse of power. The trial of the United States versus Dale Miller became a national news story. It was a perfect storm of race power and police misconduct. The small federal courthouse in Macon, Georgia, was besieged by news vans and reporters. For Miller and his lawyer, Wallace Thorne, the strategy was one of last resort character assassination. They couldn't dispute the video or the testimony of multiple officers, so they had to attack the catalyst for the whole investigation, Dr. Alana Hayes. Thorne painted Alana as an ivory tower academic, a Quantico profiler who looked down on small-town cops. He argued she was confrontational and disrespectful from the start, provoking a situation that a more reasonable person could have de-escalated. It was a classic case of victim, blaming a desperate attempt to muddy the waters. When Alana took the stand, the courtroom was silent. Dressed in a simple professional navy blue suit, she was the epitome of calm. The assistant U.S. attorney, a sharp woman named Maria Flores, walked her through the events of that night. Alana's testimony was clinical, precise, and devastatingly effective. She described every action, every word, every nuance of Miller's behavior, not as a victim, but as an analyst breaking down a subject. But the real fireworks began during the cross-examination. Wallace Thorne approached the stand, a confident smirk on his face. "Dr. Hayes," he began, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "You're an expert in behavior, is that right? You profile people for a living." "I analyze behavior to assist in criminal investigations." "Yes," Alana corrected him. "So you were analyzing my client that night, from the moment he walked up to your car." "I was observing his behavior, yes, as my training dictates for any law enforcement encounter." Thorne leaned against the railing. "And what did your analysis tell you? Did it tell you that you were dealing with a 15-year veteran officer, a respected member of his community who was simply trying to do his job?" "No," Alana said calmly. "My analysis told me I was dealing with an officer whose baseline behavior was unusually aggressive for a routine traffic stop. It told me his questions were designed not to gather information, but to intimidate. His body language was that of a predator asserting dominance over territory." A murmur went through the courtroom. Thorne's smirk faltered slightly. "A predator? That's a strong word, Doctor. Are you suggesting Officer Miller is some kind of monster?" "The term monster is a creation of fiction, Mr. Thorne." Alana replied, her gaze level. "In my line of work, we deal with men. Men who make choices. Officer Miller chose to conduct a pretextual stop. He chose to escalate the situation when I asserted my constitutional rights. He chose to draw his weapon on an unarmed woman in a locked car. And he chose to laugh when presented with my federal credentials. Those are the choices of a man who believes he is above the law, not a man who is sworn to uphold it." Thorne rattled, tried a different tack. "You refused to get out of the car, a lawful order from an officer. Isn't it true that your defiance is what caused this whole incident?" Flores objected, but the judge allowed the question. Alana looked directly at the jury. "It was not a lawful order. An officer needs probable cause to order a driver out of a vehicle for a simple traffic violation. He had none. What I did was refuse to surrender my Fourth Amendment rights, the same rights that every citizen in this country is guaranteed, the same rights Officer Miller swore an oath to protect, not violate." Thorne was losing control. He stalked back and forth. "So you decided to play lawyer and professor on the side of a dark road instead of just complying." "No, Mr. Thorne," Alana said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in. "I decided to be a professional, and since you brought up my profession, let's discuss the profile of your client, shall we?" Thorne froze. "That's not the question I asked." "But it's the pertinent one." Alana continued, her eyes fixed on Miller, who was now sweating at the defense table. "Officer Miller displays classic indicators of an insecure narcissistic personality with compensatory authoritarian tendencies. He targets individuals he perceives as weaker or as outsiders to bolster his fragile sense of self-worth. His laughter in the face of my credentials wasn't a sign of disbelief. It was a psychological defense mechanism. He was incapable of processing a reality where a black woman could hold a position of authority superior to his own. His worldview is so rigid, so steeped in prejudice, that he had to categorize me as a liar, because to accept the truth would be to shatter his own sense of identity. His aggression was not a reaction to a threat. It was a reaction to a challenge to his ego. He is in the simplest terms a bully who uses his badge as a shield for his own inadequacies. The courtroom was utterly stunned. Wallace Thorne stood speechless, his mouth agape. He had tried to use her profession against her, and she had turned it into a weapon of devastating precision, dissecting his client on the stand for the entire world to see. "No further questions, Your Honor," Thorne mumbled, retreating to his table thoroughly defeated. Alana Hayes stepped down from the stand, her work done. She hadn't just testified as a victim. She had testified as the expert. She was giving the jury a clear, terrifying window into the mind of the man who had pulled a gun on her. The last shred of Dale Miller's credibility and his freedom had just evaporated under the bright lights of the courtroom. The air in the federal courtroom was thick with a tension that felt physically heavy. For 2 agonizing hours the jury had been deliberating, and in that time, the room became a pressure cooker of whispered speculation and silent prayers. Alana Hayes sat perfectly still in the front row, a paradigm of calm she did not entirely feel. Her gaze was fixed on the empty jury box, her mind replaying key moments of the trial, the damning audio from Miller's body cam, the tremor in Javier Reyes's voice, the sneering arrogance on Wallace Thorne's face during his cross-examination. She had presented the facts. She had laid bare the psychology of the man. Now it was out of her hands. Across the aisle, Dale Miller was visibly disintegrating. The confident swagger he had carried for 15 years on the force was gone, replaced by the palsied terror of a cornered animal. He constantly wiped his sweaty palms on his ill-fitting suit pants and muttered to his lawyer, who could only offer impotent pats on the shoulder. He was a man staring into an abyss, finally understanding that his badge could not shield him from the consequences of his own actions. A sharp knock at the jury room door made the entire courtroom flinch. The bailiff opened it, and the 12 jurors filed back in their faces, grim and unreadable. They avoided looking at Miller, a sign that Alana's training recognized as almost universally ominous for a defendant. The jury foreman, a middle-aged hardware store owner, held a single sheet of paper in his trembling hand. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Arthur Vance asked, his voice echoing in the profound silence. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, his voice raspy. "On the charge of assault on a federal officer in violation of Title 18, Section 111 of the U.S. Code, how do you find the defendant? Dale Miller." The foreman took a deep breath and looked for the first time directly at Miller. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp swept through the gallery. Miller made a strangled, choking sound, as if he'd been punched in the gut. Behind him, his wife let out a single piercing sob. But the foreman wasn't finished. "On the charge of deprivation of rights under color of law in the matter of Dr. Alana Hayes, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty," the foreman repeated, his voice stronger now. "On the charge of perjury before a federal grand jury. Guilty. On the charge of evidence tampering in the case of Mr. Javier Reyes. Guilty." One by one, he went through all 12 counts, and one by one the word came back, a drumbeat of doom. "Guilty. Guilty. Guilty." With each pronouncement, Dale Miller seemed to shrink, collapsing in on himself, until he was nothing more than a shuddering heap in a cheap suit. When the last verdict was read, he finally broke completely, burying his face in his hands and letting out a raw, guttural wail of despair. Justice was not a blind concept. It was a hammer, and it had just pulverized his entire world. The week between the verdict and the sentencing saw the final catastrophic collapse of the Oak Haven County Sheriff's Department, as it had existed for generations. Facing certain conviction, Miller's closest associate on the force took a plea deal, singing like a canary about years of corruption, shakedowns, and cover-ups. Sheriff Marcus Brody, his career and reputation in tatters, held a humiliating press conference on the courthouse steps. He announced his immediate resignation, his voice cracking as he apologized to Alana Hayes, to Javier Reyes, and to the entire community he had failed to protect from the predators within his own ranks. The next day, a fleet of black sedans arrived from Washington, carrying lawyers from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division. They were not there to investigate a man. They were there to perform an autopsy on a diseased and dying department. Alana spent that week with her mother reading poetry aloud and making pecan pie. In the quiet moments, her mother would look at her with an expression of profound pride. "You faced down a bully and ended up saving a town," Sarah said, her voice weak but her spirit strong. "That's a legacy, Alana. That's a story worth telling." On the day of the sentencing, The courtroom was even more crowded. This was the final act. Dale Miller was led in, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists and ankles in shackles. The metallic clink of his chains was the only sound in the room. He looked gaunt, hollowed out a ghost, haunting the scene of his own demise. Before the judge pronounced his sentence, he gave the victims a chance to speak. Javier Reyes, accompanied by his parents, walked slowly to the podium. He unfolded a piece of paper, his hands shaking, but when he spoke, his voice was filled with a newfound strength. Mr. Miller. He began looking at the man who had stolen 2 years of his life. When you arrested me, I was 20 years old. I was on my way to a new job, a new life. I was going to ask my girlfriend to marry me. You took all of that. You threw me in a cage with violent men. You made my mother cry every single night. You made my father, a man who believes in this country and its laws, doubt everything he ever taught me. You did it because you could. Because I had an out-of-state plate and brown skin. You thought I was nobody, that I wouldn't matter. But today, Javier's voice rose, filled with passion. I am not a victim. I am a survivor of your corruption. And I will stand here in my freedom and watch this court take yours away. He sat down to the sound of quiet weeping from his family. The U.S. attorney offered Alana the chance to speak, but she simply shook her head and gestured to Javier. This was his moment. This was his justice. Finally, Judge Vance turned his piercing gaze upon Dale Miller. Mr. Miller, the judge, began his voice, a low rumble of controlled rage. In my 30 years on this bench, I have seen the worst of humanity. But there is a special place in hell reserved for those who are given a sacred trust, a badge, a gun, the power of the state, and who use it to prey on the very people they are sworn to protect. You were not a police officer. You were a predator with a badge. You were a highwayman who used the color of law as your weapon. The judge gestured towards Alana. You assaulted a federal officer, a crime of profound arrogance and stupidity. You laughed at her credentials, not because you disbelieved them, but because you could not accept them. Your prejudice was so absolute, your ego so fragile, that you were willing to risk your life and hers, rather than admit that you were wrong. That single act was an assault on the entire system of justice, an attack on the rule of law itself. He then looked over at Javier Reyes. But your true crime, the act that reveals the depth of your depravity, was what you did to this young man. You destroyed a life for sport. Because you were angry. Because you felt disrespected. You manufactured evidence with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. You threw away his future to satisfy your pathetic ego. There is no sentence I can give that will restore what you took from Mr. Reyes and his family. Judge Vance paused, letting the weight of his words settle like a shroud over the courtroom. Therefore, on the charge of assault on a federal officer, I sentence you to the maximum of 20 years in federal prison. On the multiple counts of deprivation of rights, I sentence you to 10 years for each count to be served concurrently with that sentence. He held up a hand as Miller's lawyer began to rise. I am not finished. For the crimes committed against Mr. Reyes, for the perjury, for the evidence tampering, for the malicious prosecution that stands as a stain on this entire state, I sentence you to an additional 20 years in federal prison. This court orders that this second sentence be served consecutively to the first. A tremor ran through the courtroom. Consecutively. 40 years. For the 45-year-old Dale Miller, it was a life sentence. Mr. Miller, you used your authority to put an innocent man in a cage. The judge concluded, his voice ringing like a blacksmith's hammer. It is the judgment of this court that you will now spend the rest of your productive life in one. You are a disgrace to the uniform you once wore, a cancer on the community you swore to serve. Get him out of my sight." As U.S. Marshals pulled the sobbing, completely broken Dale Miller to his feet, the sound of his shackles dragging against the floor was the sound of Karma's final, inescapable judgment. He was led away, a nobody in an orange jumpsuit, his reign of terror over. Outside the courthouse, in the warm Georgia sun, Alana stood quietly, while Javier, surrounded by his family, spoke to the reporters. He was no longer the broken man she had met in prison. He was a symbol of resilience. He thanked her, and his words caught by the microphones were for her alone. "She gave me my life back," he said. As she walked to her car, leaving the media circus behind, Alana felt not triumph, but a quiet, somber sense of balance restored. She had come to Oak Haven as a daughter been forced to be an FBI agent, and had inadvertently become the catalyst for a town's painful but necessary cleansing. The road ahead was long for Oak Haven, but the poison had been cut out. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her mother. "Come home. The pie is warm." And for the first time in a long time, Special Agent Hayes could simply be Alana, a daughter going home. The story of Dr. Alana Hayes and Dale Miller is a stark reminder that true power isn't found in a badge or a gun, but in the courage to stand up for what is right, even when you're staring down the barrel of injustice. It shows how one person's refusal to be intimidated can unravel a web of corruption and bring a reckoning that is years overdue. This isn't just a story about karma, it's a story about the strength of character and the unyielding principle that no one is above the law. If this story of justice and hard-hitting karma resonated with you, please take a moment to hit that like button to help us share it with more people. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of real-world consequences. And most importantly, if you want more compelling stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Your support allows us to keep telling the stories that matter. Thank you for listening.